welcome everybody. We're back with Gary and Gary, talking about all things COVID. It's beautiful out today. It's supposed to be 80 in the next few days. We just finished with our winter squalls. The last few days were amazing. My deck was covered with hail last evening for about 10 minutes. So done with that. Summer is here. Hey, let's go ahead and start off with our epidemiology. We'll pull up our first slide. And you can see we continue to see an increase in the 7-day moving average of positive tests. It's gone about 5% since the last time we presented. Of course, this is reportable. These are run in our lab, and so I think all of us know, even personally, people who are getting positive tests at home and not reporting them. This turns out to be a very, very contagious virus. I think a lot of us have family and friends who've been infected. So I had COVID 3 weeks ago. Unknown contact how I got it. Felt like I had a bad cold for about 2 days, and that was it. Recovered very quickly. Got kind of bored being stuck in my bedroom at home. So that's about all it was. But I think everybody hears those stories. But what's happening at the hospital?
Well, I think you're right, Gary. I think that 3 to 5 times COVID testing is happening at home versus our lab. So the uptick in our lab is the tip of the iceberg. We're not seeing much in the hospital. We've had a couple cases in the hospital of people who have come in for other reasons and they're COVID positive. We have one person come in, we thought it was COVID pneumonia, it was actually flash pulmonary edema, and they happened to have COVID. They were volume overloaded and missed a dialysis treatment. So it's been very mild in the hospital. The literature shows that for those that are getting hospitalized with COVID, and if they're vaccinated, it's the very elderly and the immunosuppressed. And so again, those are the ones we want to be very careful of and make sure that they're boosted well. I expected to see a lot of unvaccinated people hospitalized again. We're not seeing that yet. Yeah. And so I wonder if this subvariant of Omicron 2, the BA2 subvariant, is much less virulent. And I think that's my sense, is that it is less virulent, but so much more contagious.
Yeah, and perhaps we needed that because the unvaccinated people might develop some natural immunity now.
Yeah, that's a good thing. I think that's very true.
Yeah, yeah, good. Well, so this is now an ambulatory disease, and over the last few weeks, I know you did a tutorial for everybody to help us with that treatment, but so Paxlovid is now in plentiful supply and easy to prescribe. What's new with that? Are we learning more about it as we increase our use of Paxlovid?
Well, we've seen some interesting phenomena with Paxlovid. There's one thing, the first thing that's kind of in the news is something called Paxlovid rebound. So I want to kind of present a slide of that. So just to kind of summarize what is happening with this Paxlovid rebound, we knew that in some patients who naturally got COVID, there was going to be a bimodal distribution of symptoms, where their symptoms get better. First they have symptoms that get better, and then some people have a rebound of symptoms. When the FDA presented their data and they published it in the New England Journal, they didn't talk about rebounding symptoms. But in a supplemental summary to the FDA on their EUA application, there's a comment there that several subjects had rebound SARS-CoV-2 RNA levels at day 10 to 14. It's one line. And in another study, we know that 2% of patients had rebound symptoms versus 1.5% of patients in placebo arm. So even patients who naturally had COVID but didn't get treatment still had recurrence of their symptoms at a low level. So there is this slight phenomenon. And yesterday I got a call from one of our urgent care docs where he had someone who at day 7, they went on Paxlovid, but day 7, 2 days after stopping Paxlovid, they actually had recurrent symptoms. In the vast majority of these patients, when it happens uncommonly, in a vast majority, it's mild, it's 2 days of symptoms, and then they get better. There have been very few reports of people who got seriously ill in the recurrence of symptoms. And so it raises a lot of questions. And the first of all, what's the FDA position on that? You do not need to retreat people. So you do not need to reach for a different treatment or repeat the Paxlovid treatment. The question it raises to me is 5 days enough? And I think 5 days is enough in probably 99.9% of patients. But who knows? For some people, there are a couple of theories that maybe people have a longer viral persistence because they don't contain the virus very well. There's another theory that perhaps Paxlovid is so effective that it actually has an immune response. It blunts the immune response, and then virus escapes from that. What we know is so far in sequencing the virus, we're not seeing Paxlovid resistance. And again, Paxlovid is 2 drugs, right? It's a boosted protease inhibitor that gets very high levels. Now, in Tamiflu, also Tamiflu for influenza, we have seen rare cases of resistance when it's used non-judiciously, but we haven't seen Paxlovid resistance to SARS-CoV-2 yet, and that's good news. Party line is you don't need to repeat, and in the vast majority of patients, when it uncommonly happens, 1 to 2% of the time, they're going to get better in a couple days.
So this brings up a question for me. So we're getting more and more data that says it's safe, it's in supply. We're heading into summer. People are going off to foreign lands where COVID might be. Is there any rule for taking along a 5-day course of a Paxlovid with us?
So I've actually got a lot of requests from people just about this, including some people from Kaiser, and it was happy to tell them, go ask Mordor. but so far, because Paxlovid is approved under EUA, because it's paid for by tax dollars, it is not approved for taking with you just in case, and it's not approved for a lot of other indications like prophylaxis, or like post-exposure prophylaxis is another good one. So I think right now it's not responsible to give someone Paxlovid because they choose to fly to Europe for their vacation and just in case they do get sick. I think there's not enough available now should we have a really huge amount of outpatient disease in people where that would be responsible practicing. But even more important, it's not EUA approved under that, you know? And so also Tamiflu, that's FDA approved, full approval, so we can go off label for that. We really can't go off label for something under emergency use authorization. I think that's irresponsible.
Okay. So are you seeing any other rules for Paxlovid outside of the initial course of treatment with symptoms?
Well, not approved that, but I've seen some interesting information. I'll show another slide. This came from Cron 4 News, and then MedPage picked that up. Cron 4 News had a piece, and I think it's because it came out of UCSF, where 2 patients and then a 3rd patient was reportedly to have a great response to repeating Paxlovid for long COVID. So the next question is, does Paxlovid have a role for long COVID or post-acute COVID syndrome? The answer is no, not yet. And so I kind of showed here the study for the MedPage, kind of the heading of that study. I want to make a couple points for this because we've never really talked about long COVID yet. A couple points about this. One is, these are anecdotal reports. They're not peer reviewed. They were kind of put on a research server, which is kind of like a research blog. It's provocative. To me, personally, it makes no biologic plausibility. It doesn't make sense. It's not an evidence-based recommendation. And again, Paxlovid is not approved under EUA for long COVID symptoms. So if your patients are asking for this because they saw a news section on it, whether it's NPR or Cron 4 News, it's not approved and it's not appropriate to use in that setting. So I wouldn't advocate for that. Now, that raises a whole scenario. What about patients with long COVID? If we're going to have a ton of patients, not in the hospital, but in the clinic with long COVID, what do we do now? And recently there was a study out, and I'll show this in the next slide. UCLA had a study from the Journal of General Internal Medicine, just published in April 7th. 30% of people that were treated for COVID, inpatient, outpatient, had post-COVID symptoms. So long COVID, that kind of fit that. And the appropriate term is post-acute sequelae of COVID-19, or PASC, but long COVID is kind of like the common nomenclature for that. Now, patients who are hospitalized, had diabetes or a higher BMI, seem to have a higher rate of that in this UCLA study. And of these 309 patients, 31 had fatigue, 15% had shortness of breath, and in the outpatient setting, 16% had persistent loss of smell. But there's a whole host of symptoms: brain fog, myalgias, arthralgias, dizziness. And I wanted to put here that 3 local areas are studying long COVID. And I suggest that our patients should go into a research study so we can collect data on this big caveat of patients. So the Recover is an NIH-funded study happening at Stanford. Stanford's one of 30 sites that are going to have millions of dollars, like $15 million grant from the NIH, and it's going to be a 4-year-long study. UCSF has what's called the LINK study, long-term impact infection with novel COVID-19. This is going to be an observational study. And then UC Davis, for a while now, more than a year, has stood up a multidisciplinary post-COVID-19 clinic. So I would send patients who are really struggling with the quality of life, who are significantly impacted by this, to UCSF, Stanford, or UC Davis.
So 30% seems awfully high to me. Most of these symptoms, these are symptoms. So
Right.
these are subjective. Are there any objective findings come out so far that help us to make the diagnosis outside of symptoms?
Well, now that is the kicker, is because with long COVID, as we know in initial studies so far, if these patients are aggressively investigated, so if you're short of breath, what are your PFDs and your O2 sat? Normal. If you feel like you have postural dizziness and you do an echo, an EKG, a tilt table test, it's normal. If patients have this brain fog and you do a spinal tap, an MRI, a PET MRI, it's all normal. So the caveat is patients with long COVID struggle with these sequelae symptoms, but on objective measurements of everything we're doing, everything looks normal. Labs look normal. Liver functions are normal. Thyroid tests are normal. So that's why you want them in a multidisciplinary clinic where we can study this at a research level. So now at UCSF, they're studying T cells and B cells and cytokine assays to see if there's some immunologic response that's driving this. Whatever we have in traditional medicine isn't good enough to really investigate and explore what's going on with long COVID, which is why the NIH just stood up this enormous 30-site center, 4-year-long study.
So when we have an illness whose diagnosis is a clinical syndrome, that's often ripe for alternative treatments. Have you seen any articles or anything about what's out there that we might need to be aware of?
Yeah, I think it's important to tell our patients to be careful of some squirrely stuff that's happening.
Yeah.
So I've read about a couple things. Let me pull those up. I kind of wrote them down. First of all, hyperbaric oxygen always gets kind of bad press. So in La Jolla, there's a study on hyperbaric medicine. Does hyperbaric oxygen help long COVID? We'll see about that. I'm not really, that may not be promising. There's a lot of homeopathic stuff going on. So be careful with your patients who are reaching for homeopathic medicine. I've seen a little bit of stuff with naloxone and fluvoxamine. Those are not recommended for long COVID outside of a research study. There's also some crazy stuff. I heard about this thing called Zofin, Z-O-F-I-N.
Okay.
It's an intravenous, and I'll quote this, minimally manipulated human amniotic fluid concoction. And so it's an IV infusion. It's happening, I think, at Newport Beach in Southern California. I would be careful about that with your patients. I would only do that in a very rigorous clinical trial that is going to be approved. There's one in the NIH, for example. I've also read about a little bit of something called allogeneic adipose-derived stem cells. I would be careful about that. You know, there's a lot of very alternative stem cell research that's not safe, not FDA approved. So be careful with your patients. Keep them out of kind of, I would call it off the reservation type of medicine that would be dangerous for them.
Yeah. So stick to the data.
Yeah, stick to the data.
And there's very little, right?
And I would send them to an academic site, you know, especially if their quality of life is significantly impaired.
Yeah. Okay. Anything new on vaccines?
Yeah, there's one new thing on vaccines. It kind of makes it easier for everyone. The FDA came out with an alert. I'll show you the slide up here. This is a warning from the FDA. They're putting a warning on the Janssen vaccine. So the FDA is stating that on the Janssen vaccine, you want to be careful about the risk of vaccine-associated thrombocytopenia and thrombosis, called VITS. The risk is very, very low, and I put it in the slide so that everyone will be like exactly what is the data from the FDA. The risk is an incidence of 3.2 per million doses, and the incidence of that resulting in death is 0.4 per million doses. And so the FDA has said you want to have a warning on this. So what does that mean when the FDA puts a warning? The FDA didn't pull it, but they're not endorsing it, and so the CDC's come out and said there are only a very few circumstances when you might want to use this vaccine. Someone who's had a severe anaphylactic or severe reaction to an mRNA vaccine, but you still want them vaccinated, you might consider this, but the patient needs to know the risks and the benefits. It's like a black box warning. What about patients who otherwise wouldn't get vaccinated by their choice? If they would do this vaccine and they know the risks and benefits, that's not unreasonable. But clearly the two mRNA vaccines, Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, is really going to be the workhorse for the country, and they're still the best two vaccines in the world.
Okay. And then anything new pediatrics? I know that there's been some submission of data, but I think they've delayed their response, or where are we at?
Yeah, so I know that Pfizer and probably Moderna are going to have already submitted their data to the FDA, and the ACIP committee for the FDA is going to, and the CDC is going to be meeting in June. So we should hear for kids under 5, so 6 months to 5 years of age, we should hear in June what the FDA wants to do with that, and the CDC right behind that will give their recommendations.
Okay, great.
My thought is, it's probably gonna be thumbs up.
I hope so. Get the kids into summer. Well, that's what we have for today. Hope that's been useful. As always, feel free to submit any questions so we can be most useful for your clinical practice. So thanks everybody. Have a good day.